Thank you very much for that kind invitation. Just a few remarks from the background of my occupation. We have the great pleasure to be located as a public foundation at the Bauhaus building in Dessau, erected in 1926. And it is always a challenge also to, on the one hand, work in such a historical heritage building, but at the same time trying also to update this kind of pedagogic heritage from the perspective of our contemporary questions. So I'm not talking today about our own educational endeavors, rather than the task for my evening talk is more focusing on two quite interesting correspondences between two schools that has been founded almost in parallel at the same time frame, but there were only certain moments in history where they got closer to each other and met each other, and this was the historical exhibition in 1922 in Kolkata. And I'm going to use this kind of first correspondence between two schools of departure, schools of innovation, in order to outline and to sketch out few moments of this particular educational experiments in those days, talking about the 1920s. And what is very important, and that's why also I put this title, the subtitle under this headline, a universal agenda. They were both also confronted with certainly a different world in the making. They were confronted with the globality of the first decades of the 20th century. And since a couple of decades already, scholars from different fields also describe already the 19th century, the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, as a first wave of globalization. And it has certainly also a strong impact, not only on educational institutions, but certainly also, based on the sort of the global integration of the world trade in various fields. So it was certainly also challenging that the world get closer and deeper connected with each other. It was a challenging certainly also for the cultural production. I'd like to start with the Indian Society of Oriental Art, and this is an image you see here, and you certainly recognize that is a society of men. There are only one woman on the image, and this is an Austrian lady, Stella Kramrisch, an Austrian curator that was a kind of one could say, an early Indian traveler, which became then in the 70s more fashionable among a younger generation to go to India and to get a little bit lifted up from, so to speak, the pressure of the modernized, industrialized world. But Stella Kramrisch undertook that already in the 1920s. Does not move. Here we are. I'm sorry. Stella Kramrisch was an initiator of. I'm sorry. I have a couple of problems with this computer. So here we go. So Stella Kramrisch was an initiator of this rather groundbreaking show I'd like to use as a starting point of my lecture. The Indian Society of Oriental Art is today based, and this is a letter Stella Kramrisch has written to Johannes Itten, inviting actually the members of the Bauhaus to participate in that show, since she was familiar with Johannes Itten already from Vienna, where she had studied art history, and Johannes Itten was teaching there as a private arts academy, and they got together, met each other in Vienna, and from that contact was established that has brought her into kind of constant exchange between him and her. The Indian Society today is based on the 4th floor of the Apache House in Park Street in Kolkata. Tayendra Kumar Roy has been attending to the Society's heritage for a number of years already and knows certainly the legendary history of the 14th annual exhibition of 1922, in which works of the Bauhaus masters, as well as works of modern Indian artists, were shown side by side in the Society's former rooms at the Samavaya Mansions. The Indian Society of Oriental Art works in the field of art education still today. The painting class, which is held 3 times a week at no charge, is underway next door. Here, sitting in front of easels of resting drawing boards on their knees. Young people from all social and ethnic backgrounds learn to draw from a model. Roy explains that the society still organizes annual exhibitions, although the range and the context of its public activities have changed considerably. The society was founded in 1907 as a typical Orientalist club, chiefly by numerous high-ranking representatives of the British colonial government. It was mainly concerned with organizing exhibitions and cultivating the wider public taste for a new art movement which developed an independent visual culture based on local roots, craftsmanship, tradition, and pictorial conventions. The enthusiasm for Indian culture expressed by many architects of the British culture and education thereby revolved around a complex quest for a culture lost in the course of industrialization. And here, this whole framework in which a lot of British officials that were operating in the early, the first decades of the 20th century in India had, to a certain extent, still already the framework of the arts and crafts movement being trained from this kind of approaches. If this articulated a criticism of Western modernization processes, then Orientalism, and this was also the term of a lot of Oriental clubs that were established in London, for example, also in Germany, Orientalism likewise formed the ideological framework of the British colonial contributors. Little material remains of the legendary statues of the exhibition. The exhibition building was demolished in the 1940s. Possibly the only remaining original exhibition catalogue is now in Lahore, Pakistan, and photographs of the exhibition are nowhere to be found. There are just a few newspaper cuttings from December 15, from 1922, issues of the Englishman that report the opening of the exhibition, although the Society's own journal Rupam published a length review by the art historian Stella Crumlish. Nevertheless, the sparse material makes one thing clear. The exhibition was a crystallization point for complex cultural departures in late colonial Kolkata, a metropolis that had a specific presence in the world. The comparatively small community from which the Indian Society of Oriental Art derived its members was part of a wider network of international cultural, political, as well as intellectual circles and institutions, and the activities of which reflected the global nature of the early 20th century. The First World War, where Indian and British soldiers fought side by side in the trenches, was a global as nature as the departure struggles for independence that had shaped the political climate in the subcontinent for a decade and reaching its brutal climax in the Amritsar massacre in 1919. The Indian diaspora in Berlin, London, and Paris not only participated in this liberation movement, but also formed its intellectual core. At the same time, and this is crucial for our discussion today and tomorrow, the exhibition was presented as a platform for extensive international efforts to redefine the role of art, and in this context, the reform of arts education. The painters involved in that exhibition came from educational institutions inspired by a spirit of reform. Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, Lionel Feininger were among these dominant figures in the Council of Masters of the Staatliche Bauhaus in Weimar. And the same applies to the artists from the Bengali side. Nandanal Bose, Abhindranath Tagore, and Sunyani Devi were among the generation of artists who studied first at the Government College of Arts in Kolkata and then later on at the World University Shantiniketan, founded by Rabindranath Tagore. Known as Bengal School, this movement was based on a rejection of the naturalism taught at the art schools. For Kala Bhavan, the art school in Shantiniketan, India's rural culture presented a framework for an autonomous, independent cultural renewal. Our conversation with Tejendra Kumar and his colleagues revolved around those narrations, in which the Society of Oriental Art seemingly played a crucial role. And our visit was certainly motivated by the formative logic of Western knowledge production in the art history, based on the strive for evidence of archival material, for documents, for images, for publications. But those traditions of knowledge production are traversed by international wars, political upheavals, individual destinies, collapsing empires, and shifting geopolitical constellations. So insofar, the story I'm trying to sketch out together or put together tonight is an attempt to sketch out possible constellations with open ends, being always confronted with the question of the archive and also the question and the end probably also of the documents. So in a way, it's a kind of a speculative approach, what some scholars would call a more trans-historical thinking, which allows us also to use the past as a point of departure for thinking for future endeavors. But both schools, and this is probably to a certain extent kind of evident, shared, that met in Kolkata, is a strive for emancipation and in a certain parallel moment for struggling for a reform in the arts education. What they share was a universal agenda, what I'm going to discuss then at the end. Let me start with Shantiniketan teaching under the mango trees. In 1921, the London journal Nation published a text entitled A Spiritual Alliance, which stated, I quote here, while the whole world is at war, it is some comfort to hear even one voice, however still and small, persistently murmuring of peace. Amid turmoil and shouting, one may still catch the quiet words of an Indian, pleading the cause of understanding, friendliness, and forbearance, as though they, and not as devastating conflicts, were the most natural things in the world. In such spirit, it is Rabindranath Tagore has been moving almost silently from country to country and from hemisphere to hemisphere, insinuating his conception of an international university. Suspected as a seditious agitator, dodged by the government's spies, impunged by official detraction, or at the best, scornfully tolerated as an impractical dreamer. He has trodden the well-worn and dolorous path of spirit. Rabindranath Tagore's travels through Europe and the US in the 1910s were primarily motivated by the search for patrons for his international university, which he wished to establish 150 kilometers away in the north of Calcutta. He had already opened a school here at the beginning of the century, a school defined by a progressive education system that departed from the Western canon and focused on a more playful and natural teaching methods. Dance and drama classes, as well as performative exercises were therefore taught in direct contact with the rural population in their natural environment. Primarily level education formed the cornerstone of Tagore's effort to reform the education system. In 1919, Tagore established already the World University Visva Bharati, a Sanskrit name that, roughly speaking, means universal presence in one place. The title was programmatic. Tagore aims to bring the world's most compelling thinkers together here and to initiate cultural exchange from reciprocal inspiration, the encounter between East and West. The choice of location was also programmatic, for rural India harbored the cultural traditions that in turn formed the basis for a new national identity, since the urban constellation were more or less shaped by the British. So the urban culture was conceived as something original, something a new modern India could build on. The school was made up of three closely interlinked institutes. First of all, the Progressive Art School, Kala Bhavan, a school of music and performative arts, an Indology department, where most of the international academics like Stella Cramish worked, and Sriniketan, the Center for Rural Reconstruction. Before I sketch out some of the features of this educational program, I just would like to sort of frame this endeavor of reform education in the arts field in Shantiniketan in a broader context of the role of education in the colonial constellations. Education was certainly central to the colonial project, which was rooted in a kind of fin de siècle civilization movement. Mission, which was in its focus about to replace the policy of exploiting resources and workforces. And this policy was based on the conviction that non-Westerners had neither education nor culture and therefore first had to be civilized. The mission aimed to form a colonized subject that was not English in blood and color, but in taste, moral attitude, and intellect. In a way, the goal of this kind of colonial project of education was then about what Homi Bhabha called the mimic man. Cities like Kolkata until 1911, capital of British Raj, and as a harbour city deeply interwoven with the emerging world trade of the late 19th century. So in a way, a world city, on the one hand, shaped by cultural colonialism in the architecture and urban lifestyle, in taste, in the cultural milieus. And the scholar Partamitta has described this situation at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century in Kolkata as such that he said around the midst of this time frame, the taste of the elites and then also to a certain extent of the majority of the population became Victorian. But at the same time, Calcutta, as the capital of the British Raj, served also as the epicenter of negotiating between these cultural colonial institutions that has been established by the British, and then on the other hand also an emerging middle-class urban culture in which, so to speak, also a strive for cultural independence, for new forms of cultural education were at work. So it was an institutional framework of newspapers, journals, art, kind of artist clubs, but also salons that were also, as a result and as a response and as a critique against this dominance of the British cultural colonialism being established in Bengal, in Kolkata. And the house I'm going to show here, the Jorasanko house, this is the home of the Tagore family, was one of those models, one of those circles that brought together intellectual milieus from kind of a Bengali urban middle class in Kolkata. And it's not a coincidence that specifically this Tagore family, a wealthy family, played such a crucial role in this arts reform education projects in the Kolkata in the 10th and the 20s of the 20th century. Salons were held regularly here, and the so-called Bichitra Club, and this is the image underneath over there, the Bichitra Club emerged from these kind of salons and gallery events. Here prominent Bengali literary artists and intellectuals came together for evenings, readings and performances and music. But certainly it was the Indian Society of Oriental Art, rather than these salons, that provided the institutional basis for this new art movement. And this is just a side pass to give you an idea also about the sort of conflicting potential and these negotiations between these different milieus that were at work in Kolkata in those days. It's also a member of the Tagore family. Gaganandranath Tagore started his career as a caricaturist, and these caricatures for sort of collected in this kind of a journal called Reform Screen gives you a very interesting idea about the way how this sort of critical intellectual milieus were also sort of thematizing in these caricatures also their protest and their reflection upon the moral attitudes of the British against sort of the constellation of the Bengalis in those time frames. The art movement, sorry, later known as Bengal School, that was initiated at the Government College of Arts and Crafts in Kolkata and advanced thereafter at Kala Bhavan in Shantiniketan, is a manifestation of the Indian artist's complex inspiration. I have to use it in that way. Thank you. Of the conditions of cultural colonialism. And in this context stood also the involvement of Abhinandandranath Tagore, nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, and the first, in a way, director of a Bengali art school, of an Indian art school in general, as an Indian that could become the director of an art school. And with his revival of traditional Indian painting techniques and pictorial concepts, as well as his familiarity with Japanese painting and Western art movements, he had initiated a transformation of visual culture where local and global elements were uniquely intertwined. In an essay that Stella Cramish has written and published in the Rupam, I'm trying to give you also a kind of an idea how strong this gesture of such a painter like Abhinandandranath Tagore as the director of this governmental school of art, and what kind of impact it has under this kind of conflicting conditions of cultural colonialism. And I quote her, "This is the situation," she wrote. "A modern town, an incoherent population, an imported British civilization on Indian soil. Calcutta is in India, but far from being wholly of India, it is an international and commercial settlement. The people of India and Bengal who live in it had to unlearn much of their Indian and Bengali ways to keep themselves alive in it. Now they slowly try to remember. They are helped by the paintings of Abhinandandranath Tagore, the first Indian painter brought up in an international and modern town who painted in Indian style." What this quote hopefully also sort of makes visible for you is that this kind of contestation in which this claim and plea for another visual language was embedded also in another pedagogy endeavors, and we'll talk about quickly. And it's hopefully also gives you an idea about this sort of contradictive constellations in which a new nationalism in the art world sort of emerged, but this nationalism was certainly also a response to this cultural modernization that has been confronted in a way the conditions of the urban culture in Kolkata. Shantiniketan was itself a project that stood for this genuine synthesis between the review of the indigenous local cultural tradition as an attempt against the Western dominance of the arts, as this idea of copying from Western models, and the cosmopolitan spirit of the intellectual milieu, like the Tagore's family, that not only looked into Western but also integrated, for example, Japanese artists' crafts traditions. Sriniketan, not far from the this art school, Kala Bhavan, was an important part of Tagore's program, which also championed agricultural reform. Here we go. Given the fact that the majority of the Indian population lived rurally, the regeneration of the rural economy and the improvement of village life was a priority. The Center for Rural Reconstruction aimed at the reform via introduction of new methods of cultivating and organizing agriculture cooperatives, which was also inviting Western experts like Leonard Elmhurst from the UK. And in the process, the project's objective of revitalizing rural craftsmanship was to be met not only by teacher-centered instruction, but also through practical experience. Here at Sriniketan, work focused not only on the cultivation of land, but also on traditional crafts such as weaving, pottery. There were therefore lively exchanges between the two sort of locations, Sriniketan and Shantiniketan. The educational reform pursued in Shantiniketan was directly associated with the Indian independent movement. To understand the school's significance, the broader context of early articulations of the independent movement are important to mention. The emerging nationalism found its way in the Swadeshi movement, and there's no image that is more self-explaining than Gandhi sitting at a spinning wheel, which is quite later shot by Margaret Bourke-White and then was worldwide distributed. But what was even more crucial, that Tagore did not narrow his ideas that only built on the own local cultural traditions. Rather, and this is the most visible in his both school project, he pursued a fruitful exchange and dialogue between Asian and Western traditions. I'd like to sketch out now the second school, experimental school, and it's certainly a different situation also when it comes to the question of writing art history about it. Endless shelves of literature about the Bauhaus exists, endless forms of interpretation of the documents, objects, and remnants that the Bauhaus movement has left to us. I'd like to sketch out here only a few moments of this particular experimental school, and hopefully I'm able to shed light on some of the aspects that have still particular validity. They are very topical when it comes to our own sort of searches for new educational experiments. Almost at the same time frame, I mentioned that in the beginning, 1919, and born out of the dramatic experiences of World War I, the Staatliche Bauhaus Weimar was born. Formed out of the international circle of artists, a couple of men sitting here in their chairs in the Clay's atelier, that were united by the idea to consider, in a way, the building as a metaphorical idea and bring sort of all the great creative forces that were fragmented under this umbrella of this metaphoric idea of the building. This manifesto is worldwide known, and you're all familiar with it. But it sheds lights on the sort of ideas and the sort of conceptual frameworks of the departure of the Bauhaus in the end of the 1910s, and gives you also hopefully a sense of the spirit of the endeavors of the Bauhaus. And this was the early curriculum, one of the earliest curriculums that were applied in the Bauhaus. And what is very important, and probably later on also for discussion very crucial, that it was such an open curricula that it was almost every half a year changing. So also the idea of testing out different models, how to organize workshops, how to structure the calendar, and how to sort of set out also the program of the school. This was always in a certain sort of flow. The Bauhaus itself was not just about a new type of school. It was also about a completely new approach towards the acquisition of artistic knowledge, driven by a deep-rooted skepticism towards the existing academic canon and still shaped by the very idea of learning from classical models. The school didn't want to train professions, rather than aspire to unlearn, to foster the objectives of conventional knowledge and encourage openness to pre-language, intuitive and childlike instincts, continuing from there with experiments in material, color, geometry and forms. Itten declared, for example, one of the leading figures in the very beginning of that school, it is his aim to rid students of all the dead wood of convention. So this tabula rasa approach was very much at work here. But we should also embed this tabula rasa approach in the framework, in the context of the foundation of that school. And it's a very telling drawing by Paul Citron from 1922, which reflects not only ironically, but also very emotionally about the Mazdaznan cures that were introduced by Johannes Itten as a teaching device, but also as a psychological device. And it reflects upon the traumatic experiences of the most of the masters as well as the students of the trenches of World War I. So it was an attempt to clear out the body, so to kind of undertake these diets in order to get rid of the dust and the trauma of World War I. Albers described later his version of the preliminary course, which was very much in the core of the Bauhaus education, and we should be very careful always to say this is only the preliminary course that made the Bauhaus pedagogy, because it was an ongoing experimental device that shaped and also the workshop practices. Albers said, First, we seek contact with the material. Instead of pasting it, we will put paper together by sewing, buttoning, riveting, typing, and pinning it. In other words, we fasten it in a multitude of ways. We will test the possibilities of its tensile strength, and in doing so, we not always create work of art, but rather what we are doing is we experiment. It is not our ambition to fill museums, we are gathering experience. Experience and not knowledge, that's what the scholar, Bauhaus scholar Lea Dickermann pointed out, was Bauhaus' buzzword. It's referring to the decline of experience in the modern age, as it had been articulated by many cultural commentators in those days, thinking about Georg Simmel, Ferdinand Tönnies, or Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin, and you are probably familiar with his famous essay, Experience and Poverty, made a very sort of emotional statement about this moment of the decline of experience when he said, "Never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly. Strategic experience has been contravened by positional warfare, economic experience by inflation, physical experience by hunger, and moral experience by ruling powers." So, in a way, the integrated self as a conception of the bourgeois subject was here confronted with the replaceability by an anonymous personality. And in this context, the experimental ambition of the preliminary course offered a fragile bulwark against the fragmented forces of modernism. The preliminary course especially, and that's why this image of Meister Itten, introduced by Itten in Weimar and continued by Josef Albers and also more Lenot in the Bauhaus in Dessau, reflects this modern devalorization of knowledge and experience. It formed a testing ground, a place to gather experience through a sharpening of the senses and a feel for diverse materials through physical and cognitive exercises geared to achieving a balance of mind. Here one has also briefly at least to mention the fascination that did existed in Weimar also for non-European philosophies, and some of you might familiar with the esoteric at the Bauhaus in the 1919 to 1923, which was one strong camp certainly advocated by Johannes Itten and to a certain extent also supported by Kandinsky, and this esoteric sort of camp was very much affiliated and found affinities in sort of spiritual philosophy, and there was also a strong link towards, one could say and could describe it under the framework of a kind of an exotism that was very much part of the general ideological framework of the Western avant-garde as a search for alternative modes of thinking and conceptualizing against the critique of the dominance of rational thoughts and rational concepts in the West. So there was a kind of a, certainly in Weimar, a strive and an interest into this sort of non-rational spiritual ways of thinking. And with Kandinsky's concerning the spiritual in the art and his widespread publication that has been read as a kind of a bestseller in those days, there was also a plea for sort of the power of the art articulating this non-rationality, so the third dimension, the spiritual dimension that could not be captured by other disciplinary approaches. And it was even literally that India became in Weimar a trope, a cultural trope, a projector screen, a mode of critique against the existing sort of harshly devastated conditions after World War I, where the modern industrial society has shown its kind of Janus face dimensions. So just an image of a postcard of a tea house in Weimar, where certainly also Bauhaus students and masters met. And there was also a lecture about Tagore held in Weimar, in which then also sort of these kind of readings and poets of Tagore were certainly welcomed. And in addition, Hazrat Inayat Khan, there was one Indian in Weimar giving a kind of a song lecture, performative lecture, we would call it nowadays. So you see how strongly this kind of projector screen India embedded into this avant-garde exotism has been played out in the Weimar constellations. Workshops were crucial for the formation of another type of school, sort of accompanying or following actually the preliminary course, the foundation course. And there are a few images of the constellation of the workshops in Weimar, in which this idea of sort of first of all getting in contact with the material, and from that being inspired and being able to work with a particular, being talented more for metal or being talented more for wood or for weaving. So this decision for different courses has been made. I'd like to move or take you on to Dessau, since the school has different existences and certainly also different agendas and legacies, and focusing here on few moments in which you hopefully get an idea also about this conceptual idea of not training professions, but rather than providing a framework of the formation of personhood. In Dessau, the Bauhaus magazine has been established as a very important format also of communication within the Bauhaus community, and the images that have been shown in between gives you an idea of the livelihood of the Bauhaus community. So community building similar to Shantiniketan, having a close community of students and teachers together, in which sort of these ideas of the experiment could be realized. It's a very crucial moment of this reform concepts. Here in the Bauhaus magazine with this questionnaire about how do you feel in the Bauhaus, what expectations you had. They were trying to get informations about how students respond to this particular experiences of the Bauhaus. And Otti Berger, later on then quite important figure in the weaving workshop, and for a very short moment also the form master of the weaving workshop. When he entered, when she started her Bauhaus career, she was asked what she expected from the Bauhaus, and she said, and why she had come to the Bauhaus, and she said, to overcome my limitations and to find myself. And I have found myself, and now I'm learning to walk. And it sheds light on this moment of training personhood. So it's much more about this sort of learning about yourself and less about a profession. That was the agenda of that school. Otti Berger is in so far also an interesting moment to look at, since she was deeply, in a way, shaped, educated, trained, and fascinated by Moholy Notch at preliminary courses, and a strong idea of focusing on the tactile, so sort of strengthening the senses of tactility. And this dialectic between tactile versus visual was a strong sort of debate within the Bauhaus. And it stood for a certain debate within cultural modernity in those days, since what a couple of scholars would maintain, the modern culture is mainly shaped by the visual. And Ernst Kallay, editor of the Bauhaus magazine, made a very strong argument about it. And he said, we are living in an eye democracy. The same picture for millions of readers, and he's reflecting here upon the art and the time frame of reproduction. The same picture for millions of readers, the collective object, the standard seeing. And against this kind of formation of a new mode of the regime of the visual, also the foundation course and then further on the workshops were a kind of an attempt to develop and to cultivate and to strengthen another senses, mainly tactile senses, for example. So the haptic, what in German called begreifen, was a very crucial moment, what on the one hand Moholy and certainly also Josef Albers were trying to train the students. And this is just an image in which specifically Moholy in his book From Material to Architecture was trying to convey between the visual and the tactile. And in this book, From the Material to the Architecture, is also an image of Otti Berger's touch panel, German Tasttafel. And these were very particular courses, objects that were made, and this touch panel executes a relationship between the optical and the tactile. It expresses the desire to explore specific properties of different materials, wool, velvet, silk, chemically threaded cotton, through various threads. So Berger explores the specific convergencies of optical properties with tactile ones. Coming from that sort of small threads to the longer ones, just from this preliminary course, the weaving workshop is probably one of the still most interesting and very sort of contradictive and contested workshop at the Bauhaus. Since here, this issue on the one hand in Dessau mainly also the shift or the sort of the strive also for economical reasons towards production and collaboration with serial production with the industry, and then on the other hand this pedagogic endeavor to say we want to study, we want to learn, we want to experiment with the material at the loom. And the loom and the material are the basic for our pedagogic enterprises and our pedagogic sort of conceptual frameworks. So there was a growing tension field, just images from the weaving workshop in the Bauhaus in Dessau. There was a growing tension field in Dessau between, on the one hand, the situation of an experimental school that wants to be an experimental school, and then, on the other hand, in a way torn between these two ideas, providing objects that could train the wider public, could be used in everyday life, could teach as didactic object, could teach the common man for a different domestic culture that is applicable for the modern society. So, and I think the weaving workshop is one of these most interesting phenomenons in which this contestation that's being torn between two different agendas is most visible. So the alliance with the industry, in which the Bauhaus was not only economically but also ideologically engaged with, and specifically under the directorship of Hannes Meyer, which since the rational language of the industry was conceived as a universal means for fostering social progress with classless object on the one hand, and then on the other hand the situation and the player of the weavers to say we need to begreifen, we need to get in contact with the material. And I think this collage by Grete Reichert, which is called Tempo Tempo, You Need the Bauhaus, hopefully describes this constellation in a very as a very interesting metaphor. So her critique in the collage Tempo Tempo, by questioning the change of the workshop towards production units for the industry in 28, shows the workmaster, you see him over there, pointing the clock, and it includes a list of assignments of the weaver's workshop, and a quote of the advertisement of Bauhaus products is also integrated, as well as the subtitle training for the assembly line. So here, the experiment on the one hand, the claim for the holistic idea of training the whole personality, and then on the other hand, the assembly line in a way as the metaphor were in the fore. Let me come to a first conclusion, almost to the last one. Art is Life, Bauhaus and Shantiniketan. What both schools probably, hopefully, even though very sort of roughly sketched out here in my talk, hopefully show art is here understood as pedagogic practice, as an emancipatory practice even so, which is hugely topical today. These transdisciplinary experiments in institutions or exhibitions that are considered as spaces of engagement to test out new forms of knowledge and aesthetic experiences. These two art schools were laboratories for new ways of life, learning and knowing. And in its initial status, they were all about training the senses. Here, artistic education was considered as fundamental for the education of the human. So what, in a way, is the undertone or the gesture of this kind of approach is also a certain universal approach that did not privilege certain sorts of knowledge, that rather than looked into non-cognitive approaches as a critique of the existing hierarchies of knowledge, and tries to open up the realm towards all-encompassing experience via the experiment. Insofar, what was at work was a strive for a new synthesis between artistic and everyday life experiences. That's why art is life. And central to this idea of art as life, how it's been articulated in these schools, in a way, probably three moments. First of all, testing out new forms of community. So the Bauhaus conceived itself as a kind of a lived community. The images I've been showing to you before gives you an idea about it, and the same applies certainly also to Shantiniketan. Here, learning and teaching, experimenting and working, but also various everyday life practice were jointly together. Performances, lectures, celebrations, festivals were central to both institutions to formulate itself in turn, but also to the public as a creative artist community. Second, the significance of the experiment, I mentioned it quite often, within the pedagogic practice was essential for the creative process. So it was this purposeless testing of materials, forms, colors, not the results, but the process. Ways to form, or what Albus called the process towards formation, was central to the pedagogic principle. And the main interest was not, in a way, the result, but the process, the growth. Third, the solution of disciplines, not only between fine arts and applied arts, architecture, sculpture and painting, performance, photography, but it opens also new alliances between science and art, for example, or production and art. As autonomous institutions, the pedagogic practices and creativity models that differ from the existing conventional organizational principles of educational institutions positioned art as a process of exploring and learning of creative abilities, capacities in the core of their communal activities. And in its result, and it made both institutions so interesting, they had very flexible curricula. And what both shared in in general was what I would call, and it's a very tricky notion I'd like to explore finally, was this idea of a universal education that has certainly to put into a question mark. And just two little episodes that will reflect this question of the universal education, and then I'm done. Coming back to Tagore. His first international efforts, his traveling through Europe and the US to find funding for his World University, where despite its universal agenda deeply traversed by the idea of being independent from the British dominance. And this comes clearly into the fore in the correspondence between William Rosenstein, a supporter, founder of the Oriental Club in London, and a leading advocate of the Orientalism in London, and Tagore, a long-time friend. And I quote here from a letter that Tagore wrote to Rosenstein when Rosenstein offered administrative help for setting up his university in Shantiniketan. And Tagore replied in a very emotional way when he said, "I made use of the word university for the sake of convenience, but that word not merely has an inner meaning, but outer associations in minds of those who use it. And that fact tortures my idea into its own rigid shape. It is unfortunate. I'm proud of the fact that it's not a machine-made article, perfectly modeled in your, meaning Rosenstein's workshop. It is our very own. If we must have a university, it should spring from our own life and be sustained by it." It's written in 1921 in France. And this correspondence sheds light on this very moment of struggle between the so-called Western universalism, presented also in the educational institution of the university, and the prayer for local difference for a particular educational institution. From a person, actually it was considered as Western. Similarities might be found in a first transplantation, or shall I rather call it translation, of the Bauhaus pedagogy to the US, without reflecting here in detail this diverse sort of misunderstandings and reinterpretations from the 1930s onwards. In the correspondence between the major protagonists, one noticed a desperate attempt to defend the core intention of the Bauhaus educational endeavor against, on the one hand, its integration and then shrinking and reduction into a kind of a foundation course in a more on professional education focused curriculum under the American university, striving for really sort of educating professionals, training professionals, and on the other hand, the Bauhaus school as a holistic, all-encompassing idea against its narrowing into a stylistic formal language. The correspondence between Gropius and Albers, he taught already 4 years at the Black Mountain, about an exhibition, the 1938 exhibition that was held at MoMA, interestingly enough, since there was no new building for the MoMA, it was held in the Rockefeller Center, shed light on that controversies. Here Albers suggested not to put emphasis on the already known Bauhaus products. I suggest, as Albers wrote, to show the way, the methods, the ideas that are still valid and worth to be continued. The show should not present what we have done, rather than what we had intended to do, how we think and how we work. The show ended up as a flop, since the retrospective approach combined with an attempt to accommodate the American audience with a streamlined aesthetic could not communicate at all the complex, universal and contradictive ideas of the Bauhaus school. On the one hand, the critique of that exhibition in the Bauhaus reception is always talking about the missing political as well as contextualization of the Bauhaus in the US, but it does overseas often also the contested constellation how such a pedagogic endeavor had to be translated into this new context of the American professionalized university education. What is at stake here, and this is more left to discussion, is the issue of the sort of the universal, the idea of a universalism that both schools, certainly as a response towards the forces of cultural globalization, were trying also to match. But universalism is a very contradictive and very particular concept, since we all know this concept pervades, on the one hand, is pervaded by Western thinking and its problematic alliance with the colonial legacy. But on the other hand, and this is why also Tagore and also the Bauhaus used the notion of the universal, it is also understood as part of an emancipatory engagement, and it becomes very much visible in the Shantiniketan approach. So how should we frame that? Bauhaus and Shantiniketan, globalized locality as a site of a cosmopolitan practice, or what Franz Fanon suggested, position of universalism as a radical diversalism. How do we read Bauhaus in Kolkata? Probably, and this is really the final end of my talk, I'd like to quote here Saloni Mathur, a scholar that has written a quite important piece about this exhibition and also reflecting upon this particular historical moment. She wrote, "The Bauhaus and colonial Bengal. In the end, these are two dramatic, indeed explosive historical constellations. It galvanizes two powerful moments of convergence between art and politics at the beginning of the 20th century. It would be dissertive to dissolve the difficulties and paradoxes into a picture of a coherence label like the cross-cultural avant-garde. If such a notion presumes a uniform collective impetus or seeks to recuperate a simple fable of rapport. Fortunately, the art schools and art works by the Indian and European artists collected, or rather recollected, in this Bauhaus show, in Kolkata and then later on in Dessau, they do not resolve the formal cultural or philosophical differences they encountered in one another at the thresholds of modernism in the previous century. Instead, they invite a view of our collective experience through the cracks and collisions of the 20th century. At the Bauhaus, with a seemingly universal, applicable architectural culture, and they demand from us a critical re-engagement with the stories that art history has told." Thank you very much for your attention.